welcome to this episode of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mireles, and I am your host here in Harlingen, Texas, and the Rio Grande Valley of deep South Texas. Got a lot in store for you today. A little later in the program, we're going to hear our San Diego correspondent, Salvador Rivera, speak with Mr. Pedro Rios of the American Friends Service Committee. Looking forward to that conversation. It's always a very good conversation where we learn a lot of new things happening on the border when Mr. Rios is here. So I'm really looking forward to that. But first, let's take a look at some of the things making headlines across the border, starting with a huge victory for the Trump administration today. In a 6-3 decision, the U.S. Supreme Court lifted a restraining order allowing federal agents to continue conducting sweeping immigration operations in Los Angeles. Now, previously, a U.S. district judge had found that the patrols were indiscriminate and tactics used had violated the Constitution. The order from that judge barred agents from stopping people solely based on race, language, job, or location. Immigrant rights activists, along with state and local leaders, are speaking out against the higher court's decision. We're going to hear from one of those groups opposed to the ruling, the American Friends Service Committee. Mr. Pedro Rios, as I just told you, will be joining us in just a few minutes. Looking forward to that. Also happening, hundreds of people in Chicago took to the streets to challenge President Donald Trump's Operation Midway Blitz, as it's called, and the presence of ICE agents in the Windy City. This emergency protest, as they're calling it, was launched against the latest Trump administration operation that the Department of Homeland Security says targets the criminal illegal aliens who flocked to Chicago and Illinois, end quote. Protesters said they were also standing against ongoing deportations by ICE. This past weekend, over 8,000 people protested against the deployment of federal troops in Chicago. The Associated Press and other news says data they examined from President Donald Trump's federal law enforcement operation in Washington, in Washington shows that more than 40% of the arrests made in the first 30 days were immigration related. Now, Trump has portrayed this operation as one that is focused on the crime within the District of Columbia, not immigration. The AP says the data underscores that the administration continued to advance its hard immigration push in the D.C. operation. Congress did not extend President Trump's August 11th order that federalized the city's police force and launched a surge of law enforcement officials into Washington, D.C., but the National Guard and some other federal agencies will continue their deployment, and it's not clear when that might end. Time now to bring in our San Diego correspondent, Salvador Rivera, for this next story. Before we get to Mr. Rios with the American Friends Service Committee, I wanted to talk to you about something that we've been seeing. There is a growing number of migrants just across the border in Tijuana. This is your area of responsibility, Salvador. Fill us in on what's been happening.
Well, you might remember back in January, or as he was taking office, President Trump promised the arrests, apprehensions of thousands of illegal or unlawful migrants here in the United States. And he was going to say we were going to be pushing them out the door. We're going to be arresting them and sending them back to Mexico or wherever they might be from. But those numbers never really materialized. There was a shelter that opened in Tijuana, January 27th, and they were expecting large numbers. In fact, the facility can hold or service up to 2,600 individuals at one time, and they had bed space for them. They had a cafeteria. They were providing medical services. They also brought state and federal agencies to help them with paperwork. They were offering stipends and other resources to get these folks back to wherever they were from in Mexico. So they were expecting big numbers, but again, those numbers never turned out. They have been operating at no more than 20% capacity since it opened in Tijuana. In fact, last month they only saw 741 deported Mexican nationals come through their doors. And the person who runs the shelter told the press this week that sometimes there were days when they only saw one or two individuals come through the doors in a single day. So the numbers were way down. But then suddenly September came around, and all of a sudden they are seeing an uptick, what they call a surge in numbers. They've almost matched, so far the first 10 days of the year, they've almost matched the number of people that they saw for the entire month of August.
Oh, wow.
As to why this might be happening, they don't know. They don't know what to attribute this situation to. We reached out to Immigration Customs Enforcement to see why this could be happening. Are they making an effort to deport, expel a lot more Mexican nationals now than they were a month or two ago? But our phone calls and emails have not been returned. But this is something that the people at the shelter are saying. We are definitely seeing a lot more force coming through our doors, a lot more Mexican nationals being deported or expelled, not only into Tijuana, but other Mexican cities along the border from what they are telling us.
Interesting stuff, especially considering we've been seeing the number of illegal crossings at our southern border just drop significantly. I mean, these are numbers from July here, but it's definitely, counterintuitive to what we would expect. You would think that these numbers being down would mean they see less people, but this doesn't seem to be the case.
Well, perhaps they are starting to release a lot of folks who were in custody. As we know, they're having problems with not having enough bed space at the detention facilities. Perhaps this is an effort of them to start releasing folks quicker than they were. And but again, we don't know. ICE simply not telling us, not giving us any reasons for what they're doing now.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your reporting on this, Salvador. Salvador Rivera, our San Diego correspondent. Stick around because when we come back, Salvador is going to be with me again. And this time we're going to be joined by American Friends Service Committee's Pedro Rios to talk about some of the work they're seeing and talk about a little bit about this new SCOTUS ruling on ICE raids. So stay with us. Border Report Live is back in 1 minute. Welcome back to Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mireles, and I'm your host here in Harlingen, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas. Time now to bring back in our San Diego correspondent, Salvador Rivera, and his guest for today's program, Mr. Pedro Rios of the American Friends Service Committee.
Pedro, thank you for joining us. I know you're busy. I know you just got back from a big trip. Hopefully we can get into that, your trip to South America, talk about immigration. Well, what's your take on this decision by the Supreme Court? The way I look at it, it sort of puts a bullseye on a lot of Latinos who perhaps are dark complected, like perhaps don't work, are blue collar workers, speak solely Spanish. Tell us about what you think about this ruling by the Supreme Court.
Yeah, Salvador and Rudy, thank you for having me on. I think this is a terrible ruling because essentially it says if you're Latino, if you're hardworking, and if you're congregating with other people who are doing the same thing, then you're subject to being questioned and detained and asked about your immigration status. Because if we look at the pattern of practice of Border Patrol primarily, but also ICE agents and other federal agents throughout LA County and surrounding counties, they've been targeting what I would say is low-hanging fruit, going to the Home Depot stores, going to car washes, and essentially, without warrants, detaining people and forcing them, in some cases, not knowing what agencies are involved, into vans and taking them away. So what this ruling does, it legitimizes those controversial tactics that infringe on Fourth Amendment rights about how one should be questioned and the authority by which these immigration agents are undertaking to meet some sort of quota that will never be met.
Mm-hmm. I remember being young once. My friends and I would drive around town, and we could almost expect to be pulled over by some sort of a police agency. As we graduated from high school, went on to college, and perhaps got on with our lives, we expected that to cease and stop. But now you feel as if it could happen again. Tell us why now, like, perhaps we have to drive around and have our passports with us. And why is this a problem? Why is this not good for the United States of America?
Yeah, it certainly isn't the first time, as you say, that this type of tactic has been used throughout the history of immigration enforcement. Border Patrol has been around for 101 years. They've been doing this since forever. There have been other mass deportation campaigns in the 1930s, for instance, when my paternal grandparents, U.S. citizens, were picked up and taken to Mexico. It's a problem because it's an erosion of what we expect to be constitutional protections that apply to everyone. And that once that erosion begins taking place on a specific population group, then the expectation would be that other people not only in California, but throughout the county, should also expect that the erosion would be a slippery slope and we'll see this decreasing protection of constitutional rights. And that's why it becomes a problem for everyone, not just what we would perceive to say Latino men or Latinos generally in and around LA County.
So, are you advising people to walk around, make sure you have your documents with you at all times, even though the law or the way it's written, we shouldn't worry about that?
Yeah, so for U.S. citizens, you're not required to carry any sort of documentation that says you're a U.S. citizen. Simply by saying I'm a U.S. citizen, that should suffice. Now, if the immigration agents, be it Border Patrol or ICE, don't believe you, then that's on them. But I don't believe that one should take extra measures to establish your citizenship if you're a U.S. citizen. If you're not a U.S. citizen, then there might be different rules that apply. Under the Immigration and Naturalization Act, you are required to provide proof of your status when asked or questioned by immigration agents. So those individuals should consult with an attorney to determine what would be the best course of action in terms of what they provide. And then for people that are undocumented, certainly remaining silent is a Fifth Amendment protection that applies to everyone, even people without documentation. So not saying a single word is fundamental to mitigating whatever risks there might be should they be in contact with immigration agents.
From what you hear and what you're seeing, people you meet, people you talk to, you are a lot more involved with migrants than I ever will be. What are you hearing? Is there a real fear in communities as people perhaps don't think that they can move around freely at times anymore like they once did?
Yeah, I do want to validate that those feelings of fear are real. I mean, people are trying to negotiate when do they go to the grocery store? If picking up their children from school will make them a target. These are valid concerns that people have. On the other hand, I'm also seeing a lot of community-based organizing, people that are going out and trying to spot ICE or Border Patrol agents so that they inform their community members about the threats that there might be at that moment in their community. And that organizing speaks to the resistance that we are seeing throughout California and throughout the country.
Why should someone who perhaps is not Latino or is not an immigrant, why should those people be concerned about what's happening with their country?
Yeah, the good question because I don't want to give the impression that this is only a decision that impacts the Latino community. It affects everyone. If you are in a precarious immigration situation, then you could be subject to being apprehended, being arrested, being denied due process rights, sent to another country that is not your country of origin. And so I think that's where the answer to the question goes to that. Once the erosion of protected rights occurs to one group of people, then it's not a far stretch that it could also apply to another population group. And suddenly we don't have the protections that we are supposed to have under the US Constitution.
And I also wanted to ask you about the people of color in general. Does it feel like we are kept under somebody's thumb? That this is perhaps one example of being pushed back into the 1940s or 1950s when people like my father and my uncles worked the fields, but they couldn't go into towns like Kingsburg, California, or Fresno. They would only were only allowed to go out there on Sundays to go to church and do their shopping. Do you feel at times that this is perhaps where they want to put us back into this corner when we were seen as second-class citizens?
I think we are seeing a much more public resurgence of what I would identify of white supremacist ideas about who belongs and who doesn't, who merits protection and who doesn't in the United States. And that gets manifested through the policies of decisions like what the Supreme Court said. Essentially, if you're Latino, and then that means that you're a fair game to being questioned about your status because they overheard you speaking Spanish to somebody else. And so it does bring back some of those feelings of second class citizenship status and that should be an acceptable norm for how one should live in the United States. And we should plainly, unequivocally reject that notion.
Mhm. We're now hearing too about the White House drive to deny migrants the right to bail, to bond at court hearings. Why is this also a huge problem from your perspective?
The right to bail should be considered a fundamental right. You have a lot of people who can't fight their court cases when they're locked up in detention, and it's much more difficult to find attorneys to navigate legal questions. And stripping that authority from immigration judges just does a greater harm to people that one would expect would want to fight their case in such a way where they have resources available to them. Shutting down bail closes opportunities and I think fits the profile of making it much more difficult for migrants and subjects them to pressure to want to give up on their immigration cases, which could be meritorious and could be winnable cases.
Mhm. Let me take you back to what Rudy and I were discussing earlier, the amount of migrants, at least here through San Diego and Tijuana. We're seeing more people, more migrants, Mexican nationals specifically, ending up on the south side of the border. What do you attribute this to? Is this why do you think this is happening more now than perhaps 2, 3 months ago when it really was not taking place?
A couple of things come to mind for me. One is that we knew that the United States was deporting Mexican nationals to the central of the country and to the southern part of Mexico, so to Tapachula, Mexico, or to Mexico City. It could be a trend now where they're trying to send people across to the border cities because it might be much more cost effective, be much more efficient time wise, but it also might represent a growing number of migrants that are moving north again. That's a question that I would need to explore a little bit more of what makes up, what are the characteristics of the people that are showing up not only in this government sponsored shelter, but in other shelters as well.
We discussed the perhaps overcrowding at detention centers like the Otay Mesa Detention Center, which is a privately run detention center that ICE uses to house a lot of migrants who are simply awaiting a court case or were caught, not necessarily convicted of anything. Do you see that happening? Perhaps that to ease overcrowding, congestion at this facilities, that they're finally letting people go?
It could be a factor that is playing into this. We know that just last week, the week prior, there was an upsurge of cases of COVID positive in the Otay Mesa Detention Center. I'm wondering if that might be a reason where they're trying to ease the valve to some extent so that fewer people catch COVID. It could be that they're expecting now that October 1st is coming in with the new budget and much more money for detention, that they're expecting to detain more people and they're trying to in their detention centers. So a lot of factors could be playing into the increased number of deportees that are now appearing in the government-run shelter in Mexico.
Mhm. Tell me about your recent trip to Colombia. This is about migration, immigration. Tell us what you learned, who was there, and what was this workshop about?
The Global Forum on Migration and Development is a reunion of civil society organizations and governments where they come together to discuss migration and development issues, just as the title suggests. It's been going on for 15 years, actually more, but this is the 15th year that the meetings have taken place. And I had an opportunity to speak with ambassadors, to meet with other organizations from civil society, from Spain, Argentina, from Colombia, from Mexico, most all of Latin American countries, some from African countries, to compare and contrast what are the trends that we are seeing there, and how can we pressure governments to protect the very basic principles and rights that migrants should have, centered around a human rights framework. And that was the core of the commitment that civil society brought forward to governments. It's unclear what the future will be of what is known as the GFMD, this forum. We're hoping that a government will agree to host it again, either next year or the following year, so these important conversations can continue.
Is there a consensus as to why we have seen a huge slowdown in migration, not just into the US, but around the world?
Yeah, I think one of the themes that came up was that a lot of the organizations were now supporting migrants that were on a southbound migration, so like an inverse migration, especially those in Central America and in Colombia. And so the conversations there had to do with the fewer protections that migrants have are having an impact on the decisions that migrants make about where they can go and seek safety. And some of them, it was discussed, are returning to harm. When they're returning to their home country, they're actually returning to a situation where violence will continue to be an experience that they have on a daily basis. And that's just unfortunate and very frightening to think that a large number of people could be subjected to increased violence in their home countries and on their way to their home countries.
Tell us about how your counterparts, perhaps lawmakers, politicians in other parts of the world, how do they perceive, how do they see, how do they feel about U.S. immigration policies?
There was a lot of interest in hearing from me as one of the few members of civil society that was attending this global forum to hear what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing, what the discussions are like between civil society organizations in the United States. I participated in one of the first panels where I described exactly those situations. There are a lot of images that people have seen from many parts of the United States, specifically from LA County, in terms of how Border Patrol agents and other immigration officers are conducting themselves. And there's an extreme amount of worry that the degradation of the protection of rights seems to be the trend that is also being adopted in other countries as well. So it's almost as what happens in the United States now is having ripple effects in terms of enforcement and lack of care for migrants needing humanitarian support in other parts of the world.
You talked about this southbound migration. How will that hurt our economy? How will that hurt our way of life here in the U.S.?
Well, we know that our country depends on migrant labor in some important industries, whether it's the agricultural industry, whether it's the service industry, the tourist industry, people that work in the hotels and such. Without having that important labor force, then and with a declining population in the United States and really in other Western countries as well, then we're seeing that the possibility of that impacting the economies of those countries is a real threat. And unless countries such as the United States and others consider the importance of migrants and their contributions not only to their economies, but also to culture, social, political contributions, then that declining participation will have real detrimental ramifications to how we propose to move in a prosperous way for the future.
Mm-hmm. Rudy, go ahead.
All right. Well, we're actually running out of time here, but I just wanted to thank you, Mr. Rios, Mr. Pedro Rios of the American Friends Service Committee, for joining us once again on the program. Very insightful stuff, so we appreciate it. And we appreciate you too, Salvador, for your reporting on all this and getting Mr. Rios in here. So thank you guys so much. Appreciate the conversation. As for the rest of you, Border Report Live will be back in 1 minute. And welcome back to this edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mireles. I am your host here in Harlingen, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley of deep South Texas. Got one more headline to tell you about this afternoon. The No Kings Coalition is organizing another nationwide day of action protest that will happen in all 50 states. Organizers have selected October 18th as the day they want others to respond against President Trump's threatening to deploy additional militarized troops and forces into more U.S. cities. They also opposed expanding the detention and encampment of migrants. The No Kings group organized a protest in mid-June that had more than 5 million people across the country protest the president's immigration actions. Organizers said that effort was meant to send a message that, quote, America has no kings, and, quote, and that power belongs to the people. Before we go, got some housekeeping things we want to share with you. We want to remind you to check out our partners at Political Power Ranker. It's a weekly show tracking the movers, shakers, and rule makers in American politics. Nextstar's Director of Political Content, Chris Berg, and Director of Emerson College Polling, Spencer Kimball, break down who's up and who's down in the world of politics based on one of my favorite things, data. This week, they're talking about the New York mayoral race, so you're not going to want to miss that. Make sure to check it out if you're a political junkie. You can find more on Political Power Ranker at abc27.com, or you can check your local Nextstar station's website. And just before we go, obviously, we're from immigration to trade, security to culture. We dive deep into the issues impacting life along the U.S.-Mexico border. And now you can stay up to date on all of those issues in podcast form. So if you're on your commute home, maybe you're walking the dog, taking the kid around in the stroller, this is how you do it. You can subscribe now to those different places you see at the bottom of your screen there: Apple Podcasts, the iHeartRadio app, Spotify, and now we do both video and audio on YouTube, so make sure to check that out. And that is going to be it for today. My name is Rudy Mireles or Salvador Rivera. Have a great day. We'll see y'all tomorrow.